In 1490s, the Spanish Europeans first arrived in America when Christopher Columbus landed on the shores of the Americas in Mexico, Central America, most of South America, and parts of the Caribbean. In 1560s, that is by the 16th century, French Protestants built a colony near what is now known as Jacksonville, Florida. Meanwhile, Spanish, English, and French fishing fleets became regular visitors to the coast from Newfoundland. They set up semi-permanent camps up the coast to dry their catches and to trade with the local people. By the 17th century, the London Company sent out its first expedition to begin colonizing Virginia in early 1600s. The French built Quebec, and the Dutch built New York, near the Hudson River Valley. Within another generation, the Plymouth Company of 1620, the Dutch West India Company of 1621, the Company of New France of 1627, and the Massachusetts Bay Company in 1629 began to send thousands of colonists, including families, to America, specifically North America. European colonization was an invasion of territory controlled and settled for centuries by Native Americans. Native American groups perceived the Europeans' arrival as an encroachment, and they pursued many avenues to deal with that invasion, but were unsuccessful because of European diseases and their superior forces of arms. A third group of people, in this case Africans, played an active role in the European invasion or colonization of the Western Hemisphere. Virtually all European powers turned to African slavery to provide labor on their islands in the West Indies. Slavery was eventually transferred to other colonies in both South and North America. In 1730s, that is the 18th century, Georgia was colonized. Cotton was grown in new slave states of Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Farming shifted to cotton from tobacco and rice in the American South. This began in the late 1700s and became the dominant commercial crop by the 1800s. As a commodity, cotton had the advantage of being easily stored and transported. A demand for it already existed in the industrial textile mills in Great Britain, and in time, a steady steam engine of slave-grown American cotton would also supply northern textile mills. Southern cotton, picked and processed by American slaves, helped fuel the 19th century Industrial Revolution in both United States and Great Britain. Mississippi became an essential water highway. In 1756, war between France and England over the disputed Ohio River Valley happened. The conflict escalated to such an extent that it led to the 7 Years' War spread across the world. This ended in British victory and Britain taking over French territories. In early 1800s, or the early 19th century, US Congress abolished the foreign slave trade. Even after the ban, while smuggling continued to occur, the end of international slave trade meant that domestic slaves were in very high demand. Fortunately for Americans whose wealth depended upon the exploitation of slave labor, a fall in the price of tobacco had caused landowners in the Upper South to reduce their production of this crop and use more of their land to grow wheat, which was far more profitable. While tobacco was a labor-intensive crop that required many people to cultivate it, wheat was not. Former tobacco farmers in the older states of Virginia and Maryland found themselves with surplus slaves, whom they were obliged to feed, clothe, and shelter. Some slave owners responded to this situation by freeing slaves. Due to manumission, that is formal granting of freedom to slaves, free slave populations began rising in South. Complicating the picture of antebellum South was the existence of a large, free black population. In fact, more free blacks lived in South than in North. Then, Southern states increasingly made manumission of slaves illegal. Far more decided to sell their excess bondsmen. Virginia and Maryland therefore took the lead in domestic slave trade and the trading of slaves within the borders of the United States. In the early part of this period, many of these slaves were sold to people living in Kentucky, Tennessee, and North and South Carolina. By the 1820s, however, people in Kentucky and Carolinas had begun to sell many of their slaves as well. Most slave traders carried these slaves further south to Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. New Orleans, the hub of commerce, boasted the largest slave market in the United States and grew to become the nation's fourth largest city as a result. To meet the South's fierce demand for labor, American smugglers illegally transferred slaves through Florida, and later through Texas. Many more slaves arrived illegally from Cuba. Indeed, Cubans relied on the smuggling of slaves to prop up their finances. The largest number of slaves after 1808, however, came from the massive legal internal slave market, in which slave states in the Upper South sold enslaved men, women, and children to states in the Lower South. This is because, as I said earlier, Upper South had shifted to wheat cultivation, which needed lesser slaves, but Lower South was still producing cotton. The domestic slave trade was highly visible, and like the infamous Middle Passage that brought captive slaves from Africas to the Americas, it constituted an equally disruptive and horrifying journey, now called the Second Middle Passage. Between 1820 and 1860s, white American traders sold 1 million or more slaves in the domestic slave market. So in 1820s, groups of slaves were transported by ship from places like Virginia, Maryland, and North and South Carolina to New Orleans, a commercial center, where they were sold to planters in the Mississippi Valley. New Orleans boasted of the largest slave market in the United States and thus became the home to the greatest concentration of wealth in the United States. Mississippi River brought the slave traders and their cargo southwards from the Ohio River to ports along the riverbanks in Mississippi. Stops in Vicksburg, Natchez, and other major cities offer antebellum trader markets, at which southern plantation owners gather to negotiate the purchase of black men, women, and children. These purchases met the South's increasing demand for field and house labor. Stories of back-breaking toil, high rates of malaria, and intolerable heat and humidity quickly established the Deep South as particularly loathsome fates. Thus, to be sold down the river was to commence a life of crushing circumstances. There was a practice of banishing the most aggressive slaves to Deep South farms, where they would be molded and broken down by slave breakers. Also adding to the distress of southern transfer was slaves' geographic and symbolic journey away from freedom. Increasing northern resistance to the institution of slavery made escape seem viable. But southern plantations were surrounded by impenetrable forests and deadly swamps, meaning that escape would require a much longer, more perilous journey than simply crossing a border into a free state. And a lot of rebellions happened during this period. In 1811, Louisiana saw the Charles Deslandes slave uprising. 1830s saw the writing of abolitionists reaching larger audiences. Calhoun and Fitzhugh defended slavery. Louis Agassiz gave his theory of polygenism, showing how different human races came from separate origins. In 1831, Virginia saw the Nat Turner slave uprising. In 1850s, demands for slave reached an all-time high, making the prices double. And that's when the South started demanding the reopening of slave trade. This period also saw a political expansionist drive, called filibusters, where men would lead unofficial military operations to seize more land in North America. To ambitious white planters, the extent of new land available for cotton production seemed almost limitless, and many planters simply leapfrogged from one area to the next, abandoning their fields every 10 to 15 years after the soil became exhausted. The slaves composed the vanguard of this American expansion to the West. While many people may believe that slavery made the South prosper, but it is a fact that its wealth was very unequally distributed. Not only because upward social mobility did not exist for millions of slaves who produced a good portion of the nation's wealth, but also because only 3% of whites owned more than 50 slaves, and 2/3 of white households in the South did not own any slaves at all. In the South, living the American dream therefore meant possessing slaves, producing cotton, and owning land. Despite this unequal distribution of wealth, non-slaveholding whites shared with white planters a common set of values, most notably a belief in white supremacy. Whites, whether rich or poor, were bound together by racism. So slavery diffused class tensions among them, because no matter how poor they were, white Southerners had race in common with the mighty plantation owners. There was also a concept of honor in the South, a complicated code of honor among the privileged white Southerners, which dictated the beliefs and behaviors of gentlemen and ladies. Maintaining appearances and reputation was supremely important. And the concept of honor in the antebellum South had much to do with control over dependents, whether slaves, wives, or relatives. Insults in the form of words or behavior, such as calling someone a coward, could trigger a rupture that might well end on the dueling ground. Dueling had disappeared in the Antebellum North by the early 19th century, but it remained an important part of the Southern code of honor through the Civil War years. Southern white men, especially those of higher social status, settled their differences with duels, before which antagonists usually attempted reconciliation, often through the exchange of letters addressing the alleged insult. If the challenger was not satisfied by the exchange, a duel would often result. Finally, in 1861, the American Civil War happened. It was a war fought between the Union, that is the North, and the Confederacy, that is the South, from 1861 to 1865. The war was fought over the expansion of slavery into Western territories. The Union won, and it led to the end of slavery. This is known as the Reconstruction Period. It refers to the period following the American Civil War where the Southern states were being rebuilt and reintegrated into the Union, focusing on establishing new political and social systems, particularly aimed at granting civil rights to formerly enslaved people. In 1877, the post-Reconstruction period happened, which is the time that followed Reconstruction, often marked by a return to white supremacy and a rollback of many of the gains made during Reconstruction, especially in the South. This was a time when the rights of black people were increasingly restricted. The period began after the Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 was an informal agreement between Southern Democrats and allies of Republican Rutherford Hayes to settle the result of 1876 presidential election and negotiate the acceptance of Hayes' election. Democrats agreed not to block Hayes' victory on the condition that Republicans withdraw all troops from the South, thus consolidating Democratic control over the region. As a result of the so-called Compromise of 1877, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina became Democratic once again, effectively bringing an end to the Reconstruction era. It was only in the 1960s, that is the 20th century, that African Americans finally began enjoying their rights under the Constitution. An important American writer that was writing during the Antebellum period, even after the Civil War years, was Mark Twain. Twain's written works challenged the fundamental issues that faced the America of his time: racism, evolving landscapes, class barriers, access to education, and more. But he was not always considered as an important writer, or a writer to be given attention to at all. Professor Richardson, in his book The American Literature, said that 2 or 3 divisions of American humor deserve somewhat more respectful treatment, and he proceeded to give a full page to Petroleum V. Nasby, another page to Artemus Ward, and 2.5 pages to Josh Billings, while Mark Twain had received less than 4 lines, after stating, in the case of authors like Mark Twain, temporary amusement, not literary product, is the thing sought and given. He represents an attitude towards Mark Twain that was common all during the 80s. In the early 1900s, a profound change took place in the attitude of the reading public towards Mark Twain. God had done it all for Mark Twain. If there be a living American writer touched with true genius, whose books glow with the divine fire, it is him. He has always been a conspicuous artist, but no amount of industry could ever have produced a Huckleberry Finn. Twain was heavily against the idea of good old days. He believed that 20 years of modern American life are longer and richer in content than the old patriarch's 1,000. Ours will be the true age in which to live, when more will happen in a day than in an year of flat existence of our ancestors. Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is a satirical novel that critiques the romanticized notion of the good old times by exposing the harsh realities of feudalism, monarchy, and blind tradition. Twain's philosophy of life, rooted in pragmatism, democracy, and a deep skepticism of aristocratic privilege, permeates the novel as he contrasts the technological and intellectual advancements of the 19th century with the ignorance and oppression of King Arthur's court. He has us believe that our age, not theirs, is the good time. Nay, ours is the age of magic and wonder. We need not regret and melancholy, sentimentality, and picturesqueness of bygone days. For we ourselves live not in a material and commonplace generation, but in the very midst of miracles and romance. Merlin and the Fay Morgana would have given all their petty skill to have been able to use a telephone or a phonograph, or to see a moving picture. The sleeping princess and her castle were awakened by a kiss, but in the 20th century a man in Washington touches a button, and hundreds of miles away tons of machinery begins to move, fountains begin to play, and the air resounds with the whir of wheels. In comparison with today, the age of chivalry seems dull and poor. If we talk about Mark Twain's humor is purely American. It is not the humor of Washington Irving, which resembles that of Addison and Thackeray. It is not delicate and indirect. It is genial, sometimes outrageous. It is difficult to read him in a library or a streetcar, for explosions of pent-up mirth or distorted face are apt to attract unpleasant attention in such public places. Mark Twain's humor is boisterous, uproarious, colossal, overwhelming. As has often been remarked, the Americans are not naturally a gay people like the French, nor are the Americans light-hearted and careless like the Irish and the Negro. At the heart, they are intensely serious, nervous, and melancholy. For humor, therefore, the Americans naturally turn to buffoonery and burlesque, as a reaction against the strain and tension of life. In his travel books, we are given the attitude of the typical American Philistine towards the wonders and sacred relics of the old world, the whole thing being a gigantic burlesque on the sentimental guidebooks which were so much in vogue before the era of the Baedeker. Although Mark Twain has the great qualities of the true humorist, like common sense, human sympathy, and an accurate eye for proportion, he's much more than a humorist. His work shows very high literary quality, the quality that appears in first-rate novels. He has shown himself to be a genuine artist. He has done something which many popular novelists have signally failed to accomplish. He has created real characters. His two wonderful boys, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, are wonderful in quite different ways. The creator of Tom Sawyer exhibited remarkable observation. The creator of Huck showed the divine touch of imagination. Tom is the American boy. He is smart. In having his fence whitewashed, in controlling a pool of Sabbath school tickets at the precise psychological moment, he displays abundant promise of future success in business. Huck, on the other hand, is the child of nature. Harmless, sincere, and crudely imaginative. His reasonings with Jim about nature and God belong to the same department of natural theology as that illustrated in Browning's Caliban. Robert Browning's dramatic monologue, Caliban upon Setebos, 1864, explores the nature of religion, power, and human through the mind of Caliban, a character from Shakespeare's The Tempest. The poem is a philosophical meditation on the way primitive beings conceptualize their gods, reflecting Victorian anxieties about faith, science, and evolution. To know more about Robert Browning and their dramatic monologue, have a look at this lecture. Coming back to Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, both of these are prose epics of American life. Nearly all healthy boys enjoy reading Tom Sawyer because the intrinsic interest of the story is so great, and the various adventures of the hero are portrayed with such gusto. Yet it is impossible to outgrow the book. The eternal boy is there, and one cannot appreciate the nature of boyhood properly until one has ceased to be a boy. The other masterpiece, Huckleberry Finn, is really not a child's book at all. Children devour it, but they do not digest it. It is a permanent picture of a certain period of American history, and this picture is made complete not so much by the striking portraits of individuals placed on the huge canvas, as by the vital unity of the whole composition. If one wishes to know what life in Mississippi really was, to know and understand the peculiar social conditions of that highly exciting time, one has merely to read through this powerful narrative, and a definite, coherent, vivid impression remains. Mark Twain is through and through American. If foreigners really wish to know the American spirit, let them read Mark Twain. He is far more American than their favorite specimen, Walt Whitman. The essentially American qualities of common sense, energy, enterprise, good humor, and Philistinism fairly shriek from his pages. He reveals us, in our limitations, in our lack of appreciation of certain beautiful things, fully as well as he pictures us in coarser but more triumphant aspects. It is, of course, preposterous to say that Americans are totally different from other humans. Americans have no monopoly of common sense and good humor, nor are they all hidebound Philistines. But there is something pronounced in the American character, and the books of Mark Twain reveal it. This was all about Mark Twain, and a little look upon American literature. You might have noticed that I majorly cover British literature in this channel, and Mark Twain is heavily American. But he is studied in British literature because of his significant influence on the literary world at large, particularly his unique style that incorporates American vernacular language, his sharp social commentary, and his ability to create complex characters that resonate universally, making him a valuable figure for understanding broader trends in literature beyond just American borders. His works also often engage with themes that transcend national boundaries, like social injustice and human nature. But if you wish to strictly stick to British literature, then you can look at this lecture on Charles Dickens, who is often most cited as similar to Mark Twain.